Welcome to the Cinematologist podcast. I'm Dario Linares, and with me, IRL, is my good friend Neil Fox. Neil, great to be sitting just across from you.
Yes, it's lovely to be sitting across from you in London's beautiful Garden Cinema, who are hosting this in-person recording. It's really lovely to be back in London and back doing this in the same room. It's always a very, very nice pleasure.
Yeah, it's great, and also we've had a couple of we've had a bit of time to be able to sort of shoot the breeze before actually taping, which has been nice. It hasn't been like, let's get in there, get the taping done, and you've got to shoot off again. And yeah, it's nice to be in this venue, which is a favourite for watching, but also taping. It's just it's got these fantastic little cubby holes that are ideal. I don't think that they're kind of deliberately soundproofed, but the way it's just been designed is just perfect for sitting and chatting in the middle of the afternoon about film. And as usual, thanks very much to George, the film curator here, for allowing us to do that. So, Neil, how have you been?
I'm good. Yeah. I'm enjoying sitting below pictures of Catherine Deneuve, talking about film. Feels very apt. I've been good. Busy and kind of a lot of work on, a lot of travel. But this was a nice trip because, as you sort of said, like the purpose of the trip was to hang out and to record in the middle of that. But yeah, we hung out last night at the another cinema, which we won't name while sitting in this one. And just had dinner, and it was really nice. So just nice to just hang out and spend a bit of time chatting about film and just that. Again, work is full on, and this is just such a nice space, as in the podcast, to, we were talking about this last night, kind of watching intentionally and kind of having a purpose to the watching, and then being able to talk about it and think about it in this way is so valuable when life is so chaotic. So yeah, it's really nice to be here, kind of happy to be talking about. Happy to talk about this film, and also a bit sad to be talking about this film given recent events.
Yeah, it's a bittersweet one, and it has that sort of, I don't want to call it morbid serendipity, but we had this episode in mind for a while, and yeah, I mean, it's fantastic that Mark Jenkin, who is our guest today, loves to come back on. He's obviously an old friend of ours. We talked with him down at Falmouth, and you still do, to a certain degree, when he's not making his blockbuster.
To the degree that he does any teaching.
Right. Not to slag him off.
He's a busy man.
He's got other things to be doing at the moment. But yeah, it's always nice to have him back on and do these now regular live screenings that he comes and he picks the film, introduces it, and then you guys have a chat down at Newlyn in the lovely the cinema space down there. So that's all to come. Before I get you to set it up properly though, Neil, I just want to say thanks very much to Aaron Cabrero, who is a new Patreon subscriber.
Thank you.
And Aaron kind of got in touch with me in a really interesting way on Instagram. He obviously came across one of the pieces that I'd written on Substack. I think it was the Cinema and the Art of Radical Thinking, which was linked to
the Rod Stoneman,
the Rod Stoneman episode that we had here. And he sent me a couple of like voice notes through Instagram, which I didn't even know you could do. But it was buried behind the non-friend, who is this person, potential spam wall. It had gone into that section, and as I was going through sort of deleting all these, random OnlyFans messages that I get, as we all do,
I thought, not all of us, Dario. So
I'm trying to sort of make sure that, this isn't something I get regularly, deliberately, But I saw this one, I thought that looks like a real message. So I opened it up and he was just very, very nice about the piece of writing that I'd done, and sent a couple of voice messages and would I watch his film. So I and sometimes I'll turn on a film and I'll be like, yeah, not bothered about that. Thanks for the comments, but the film you've made, I'm not really that interested in. But I thought this was a really great film. This was called Anxietus. It's a 15-minute short, really interesting, dark, intense, like soul-crushing kind of soundtrack that is relentless throughout. But it's got this kind of Lynchian aura to it. So I was really impressed with it. And I sent him a message back, and we got talking, and he's going to come on and talk about the film on my other new podcast now, Cinema Body, Cinema Mind. But he's joined a Patreon and has been sort of working his way through the podcast. So a real sort of now a new person who's sort of delving into the archive of the Cinematologist.
Well, yeah, there's a lot there, and hopefully we can keep him interested with the new episodes. Yeah, that the Radical Thinking podcast, kind of got an interesting response. I got a message from Rod, who one of his old colleagues had just sort of seen it pop up online and listened to it, and sent him a message being like, what a great talk, just like, didn't know you were kind of out there doing that kind of thing still. So, and Rod hadn't listened to it back yet because he's a bit kind of nervous about, but was sort of, had the validation of someone being like, heard this thing and it was really good. So yeah. And it's, again, another lovely example of the kind of episodes we want to do. And it's so nice to have that, which is very much niche and very much like, people responding to those episodes is differently special to the kind of the more mainstream stuff we do as well. So yeah, thanks to everyone for engaging with that.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. And as always, thanks to our regular Patreon subscribers for supporting us. It's really, really helpful. Keeps the show going. Allows us to do these in-person episodes too, which is always lovely. And yeah, if you want to go over to patreon.com/cinematologists, and you'll get all of our bonus content,
including one we're going to tape after this recording.
Indeed, yeah. Thanks for reminding me. So yeah, we're going to have a chat we're going to sort of return to the previous episode on Wojciech Haas and on Polish cinema more broadly, because we saw another film called The Hater, which is directed by Jan Komasa, which is much more a contemporary film from 2020, which was recommended by
Michael Brook, on the interview, yeah.
Yes. So Neil, why don't you set up this episode, which is on Oliver Stone's The Doors, which, as we discussed, was selected by Mark Jenkin. And we'd have it kind of, in our plans to screen this, and the date was set for when you were going to show it in Newlyn. But then suddenly, very sadly, Val Kilmer passed away, and we were talking about you coming up and recording and sort of discussing it in the wake of that. And then I think our discussion after the film, me and you, will probably be more focused on Val Kilmer.
Yeah.
Whereas the discussion that you had post screening the film with in the cinema with Mark was much more sort of Doors focused and.
Yeah. So you're right. Yeah. So I think there is, as you'll hear, there's a little bit in terms of Val Kilmer as a star, but yeah, certainly that was wrapped up with, a lot of talk about the film itself, and Oliver Stone and the Doors. Kind of as with a lot of those screenings, it kind of goes in lots of different directions. But yeah, so following our screening of Big Wednesday last year, Mark sort of really enjoyed that experience and said, would we be up for doing another one? And I said, yeah, that'd be great. And he said, I got a film in mind. And then I think it was in his studio, and he sort of revealed to me, he was like, it's The Doors. And it was completely unexpected. But then latterly was like, well, of course that makes sense, because no one's thought about this film in such a long time. Like, it's Oliver Stone is not part of the conversation very prominently as a filmmaker, and this film is not sort of regularly sort of referenced. But talking to Mark, I knew how important it was to him as a kind of formative influence, both in terms of a desire to be a filmmaker, but also aesthetically, and the fact that he can still locate choices in films that he's making now that kind of directly relate to this film. I thought it'd be really interesting to screen it and kind of go through that. And I hadn't seen the film since around its release, I think, sort of 92, 93. So
it's been a while. I think I've rewatched it maybe once in what is it, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, nearly 30 years. Maybe over 30 years, man. God, 91. So yeah, 30 odd years. Oh God, feeling old now. Don't. That's the problem with dates. You just like, oh my God. And it's interesting to see the film on the big screen in a kind of like really, really nice version. Is how fresh it did not feel like a 30-year-old movie.
You watched the director's cut. There's a director's cut on Prime, which is what I watched.
Yeah, which is shorter. And yeah, as there'll be a sort of a later bonus episode, which I think we talk about it on there, which is just me and Mark sort of talking, rambling in the cinema before the film, about it and kind of stuff. And he was sort of saying at one point that basically when Oliver Stone went back, there was a scene he really didn't like that he took out, and that's the director's cut out. He never really liked it, and in retrospect, he didn't want it in there. So that odd version of a director's cut is actually shorter, and arguably better for not having this kind of scene. And it's right at the very, very end. And the ending is such a kind of poetic ending, in the way it kind of laid out. So so we watched that version, and it's a really nice, now hopefully a regular occurrence where Mark picks a film and we kind of get together, and there's a really great crowd, like a good house, engaged audience, and thanks again to Newlyn Filmhouse for hosting the screening. But literally a week later, with the death of Val Kilmer, it sort of made sense to bring the release of this episode forward so that we could just kind of engage with him and that aspect of it, between us and on the podcast at a time when he's kind of very much in cinephiles' thoughts.
Yeah, it's interesting because we'll definitely come to Val Kilmer later, as we said, but I hadn't seen this in a while, as I said, and I'll comment on some of the things that Mark said because I agreed with certain aspects, I think, very strongly in terms of how he read it. But it's interesting because I like Oliver Stone probably more than you. I really like Born on the 4th of July. I think that's an amazing film. I like the sort of aesthetics of JFK and that sense of a history lesson married in with a kind of prosecutorial, this is what we need to find out kind of thing going on. But the myth making here is really interesting because I think that's something he does as well. But it's very baggy.
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about that at the end. But it was fascinating to hear sort of Jenks's reflections as a filmmaker, and particularly as well with me sort of teaching editing now, because there's this film is montage-tastic. The Helen Berry plays, and it has that underlying. And I mean, it reminded me a little bit of the way Paul Thomas Anderson uses music. Particularly Magnolia, where it literally is a sort of soundtrack all the way through. Any or very few parts where there's no music kind of underplaying at all. But I think I'm really interested to focus on Val Kilmer, and I watched the 2021 documentary Val, which was really interesting in the light of his performance in The Doors as Jim Morrison, because I think that film plays up comparisons. And honestly, I'm really interested at the moment in the sort of correlation between acting, persona, stardom, and then how that feeds how we see people in this kind of matrix of identities.
Nice. Cool. Well, lots to chat about then. So let's get into it. This is Mark Jenkin and myself screening The Doors at Newlyn Filmhouse.
Is everybody in? Is everybody in? The ceremony is about to begin.
Bobby Krieger, guitar player.
John Densmore, percussionist, 22 years old. Far out.
Pamela Morrison, ornament.
Raymond Daniel Manzarek, 1-2-12-39, musician.
Name, occupation?
Jim.
You know the day destroys the night. Night divides the
Sides are
day.
being chosen. The planet is screaming for change, Morrison. We gotta make the myths.
You need to say the first shaman invented sex.
Break on through to the other side.
They call him the one who makes you crazy.
I'm the Lizard King. I can do anything.
Jim Morrison, the god of rock.
The
guys at Network have told us that they have a little problem with the lyric, girl, we couldn't get much higher. They asked if you could say instead, girl, we can't get much better. Can you dig that?
Girl, we couldn't get much higher.
I love it when you sing to me.
I'm the poet and you're my muse.
Do you hear them out there? It's you they want now. You ever tried drinking blood?
Mr. Morrison, you've gone too far.
You're a poet, not a rock star.
What you gonna do for Act 3?
Go on, kill me. Come on, give me some death.
Let's just say I was testing the bounds of reality.
That was lovely. Thank you so much. Welcome to Newlyn Filmhouse for this very special screening of Oliver Stone's The Doors as part of the Cinematologist podcast. I'm Neil Fox, one half of the Cinematologist. The other half is in London. Don't hold that against me. Dario Linares. We've been doing the podcast for 10 years. This month, actually, was the first time we published an episode. And we've been going all that time. And a lot of that time, we've done events here over the years. We've screened some really fantastic stuff over the years. And this is becoming an annual tradition now. This time last year, Mark, who's going to sort of talk a little bit about why we're screening this film, asked to screen Big Wednesday, which we screened. And so, was anyone here for the Big Wednesday screening last year? Yes. So yeah, thank you for coming back. And I'm sure we'll have a similar conversation at the end about what was all that about this evening. As with Big Wednesday last year, have not seen this film since it was released in over 30 years. I haven't seen this film, so I'm really excited to revisit. Who hasn't seen The Doors? Okay, a few. Good. All right. That's going to be an interesting one. But yeah, thank you so much for coming out. We will watch the film and then we will have a kind of conversation afterwards about it. So we'll be inviting you to share your thoughts and questions at the end. And yeah, I'm really excited to get on the screening. But Mark's going to say a few words because this is Mark's choice again. So it behooves us to ask him to explain why.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, thanks a lot for coming along. When Neil asked me to pick another film following on from Big Wednesday, this one just jumped into my head straight away because it's another film that's a massively influential film for me. I'm just finished my new film. I'm just about a couple of weeks away from finishing my new film, and I've realised that in the new film there's two direct homages to this film, or like blind theft from this film. For one that I've recently cut out of the film, and another one that I hadn't noticed, but having watched the film this afternoon, I've realised I've stolen an exact line of dialogue, which is weird to be able to steal a line of dialogue from a film set in Los Angeles in the 60s about a rock and roll band and put it into a film about Cornish fishermen. But I think there must be a crossover, which is why I love this film so much. And I think I've never seen this on the big screen, so this is another reason why I picked this film. I was 14 when this came out.
Yeah.
So I didn't get to see it at the cinema because it is an 18, so I wouldn't have been able to get in. But it did have a massive effect on me. And I think what I've realised since in the last few years, and this is a cheesy bit of Hollywood dialogue, but this is the film. I went into this film, even though I didn't go into the cinema, so I went into my front room. I went into this film wanting to be a rock star and came out wanting to be a filmmaker. And I think that this is that film. So it means a huge amount to me. It'd be interesting to see what people who haven't seen it make of it, and also people who haven't seen it for a long time, like yourself, make of it.
Yeah, excited. Right, let's get it going, and we'll see you after. Thanks very much. All right, thank you. Thank you for staying, and yeah, let's get into it. Do you want to start with your reflections on the big screen?
Yeah, that's the second time I've seen it today.
I love how obsessive these things start with. Like, yeah, second time today.
Yeah, very different on the big screen. And the other thing is, when you haven't watched it on a big screen, it normally means you haven't watched it communally as well, which is just as important as the fact that it's on the big screen, is seeing it communally. So it was quite exciting. I mean, I loved the beginning of this film. I have some issues with where it goes.
Anything in particular?
It's just a lot of it really concentrates on the sex for quite a long time, doesn't it? Yeah, and you sort of forget that he was a musician for a while, and just think he was sort of like a professional sex man for a while, that
was the album that wasn't released, wasn't
it? Yeah, not even that good by some accounts. But I think which becomes very apparent when you're watching it communally, because I knew certain, because I've seen it earlier and seen it so many times before. I suddenly became really conscious of like, oh no, there's another blowjob coming out, and it's like. And there's a lot of nudity, and it's not really equally divided up between the men and the women in the film. Is nothing. That was all of the problems that I have with the film become very obvious when you're watching it communally. So, but it was just. Ian here just said to me a minute ago, like it feels epic, such an epic film.
Yeah.
And I think the beginning and the end are fantastic. I loved the first sort of hour so much. There's so many ideas in it, and even aside from the Jim Morrison Doors biopic, just formally how experimental it is as a film is just crazy, because it's right on the cusp of CGI, and I think they, Oliver Stone worked with ILM on a lot of the effects work, but it's quite subtle. And then a lot of the optical effects stuff and the editing and the symbolism, I found it that like the whole symbol of death in it. I found the ending when he sees himself as a kid and he goes over and sits on the knee of death at the birthday party, and then Morrison sort of collapses onto the table and realizes that he's only got a few weeks to live or whatever. I found all that quite moving watching that communally, for and considering what a dick he is portrayed as, the caricature of him is quite amazing. I was quite surprised how moving I found the end of it. What did you think? I was really interested to see what you thought, because you haven't seen it since 1991.
Yeah, it would have been about 93 maybe. 93, 94 was when I saw it. I didn't see it when it came out. But again, a bit too young. And I saw it at college. My brother was like proper obsessed with the Doors and Jim Morrison. And in that kind of like sixth form period where he was just convinced he was reincarnated. Leather trousers and not washing leather trousers for a number of weeks like Jim Morrison, but he really got into that. So we watched that film a lot then, and then it kind of I hadn't watched it since. And I was saying to you before, like with a lot of Oliver Stone stuff, I just haven't gone back to it. But I really loved it, and I think part of it was the epicness of it. It really feels like a massive. Well, it's funny because it keeps repeating the line, like, make the myth. And that's all he's interested in, as a filmmaker. He's not interested in the music particularly, although I'll come back to something interesting I thought about the music. But it is very much about American mythology in that period for him as a filmmaker. Very close to Natural Born Killers in a lot of ways, which I was surprised about. It's kind of made me revisit that film in my mind a little bit differently. particularly around sort of First Nations imagery and sort of legacies of that, and how that's incorporated into white culture. I think is really interestingly done. He's amazing. Meg Ryan's amazing in it. Very funny. It doesn't do the traditional biopic thing of like, here's how they recorded the first album and here's how, there's little bits of that in there, but then it becomes much more about this figure and sort of, the mythologies around it.
And it's not about the Doors.
No, it's got nothing, it's about him. Yeah. Which I think is apt in terms of the band, in terms of a lot of the friction that
obviously backstory of you get a little bit of Ray Manzarek, but only because he was at UCLA studying film with Morrison. You get nothing of Robbie Krieger or John Densmore, and so it's really not. It's kind of mistitled in some ways. I remember thinking when it came out, why haven't they used the Doors typography in the title? And now I sort of think it's maybe not referring to the band. The title of the film isn't referring to the band. It's referring back to that original conversation that is one of the true stories of the film, is when he meets Ray Manzarek on Venice and talks about the band name. It's referring to that really rather than the band. And actually, Oliver Stone, he even says at the beginning of the film when Meg Ryan says, you got a problem with Doors, and he says they're a waste of time. That's straight away saying this isn't, necessarily what you think it's going to be. And also it's like, because it's got so much criticism for not being factually correct, but how would you make a film that's totally factually correct? And Manzarek said it's not about Jim Morrison, it's about Oliver Stone wearing leather trousers. And there's there is obviously so much of him in it, and the whole bit with the critic in the New York, in the hotel room, when she's sort of like slagging off his poetry book and stuff, which is so clearly based on Pauline Kael, who the film critic who Oliver Stone obviously had a beef with, so put that in there to sort of, so it's as much as all these things. It's as much about the filmmaker as it is the subject.
Yeah. And as an iconic character, Morrison has that ability in terms of what he's represented as and what he was probably really like, probably miles apart. And I know that was Manzarek's issue with it, but obviously, it's not. And we were talking about this earlier, like when it comes out is sort of around. It doesn't really feel like it's connected to any kind of real Doors revival, the film sits sort of out of time, but then the band do as well. They've never really had that consistent, widespread, sort of cultural place. They still feel quite counterculture, quite outsider, as he does as a filmmaker. I think increasingly in American cinema. What was so thrilling about it, was a lot of the filmmaking was so good, particularly in that first hour, like so exciting. Visually, formally, the editing just puts you in this really intense space. I think I found it a really intense experience. And what it was kind of probably unfair to sort of say about he's not interested in the music, because I think there's a particular way that he is, which is it reminded me of like a jukebox musical in a way that has become very, very common, which is like just laying the songs over the top, but they sort of form their own narrative in really interesting ways that are not necessarily biographical or directly literal, which I thought was really interesting.
Because they're almost entirely chronological, almost. But there's a bit at the beginning when it's when the titles are still rolling, and Morrison goes from Venice Beach, and then follows Pam to the Venice canals, and then he's on the bridge, and Love Street starts playing, and every time I watch it, I think he's gonna sing it, because he turns around as if he's gonna sing it. So it could almost, at times, it is almost like a musical.
Yeah, that's a bit Jacques Demy, that bit. But it felt like a provocation watching it again, in terms of like almost saying like, do you think this is a literal? This is why when he wrote this song, or this is how he wrote this song. And it felt like he was just begging that question, but almost sort of goading in terms of like, do you think this is the literal moment where he had these, which I think is a comment on a lot of how films about musicians were made at that time and still continue to be made. And it reminded me a lot of the Complete Unknown which I really loved, the Dylan one, for similar reasons, because it was just like, it just threw all facts out the window and was not interested in that. And it might be something that sort of coincide with what actually happened, but it's not by design. It's trying to do something else.
Yeah, and I think because it's about real people, there's a sort of, I think there's a reaction to it that from the audience, or the audience at the time, and especially Doors fans and people that were keeping the Doors story, protecting the Doors story, that it was somehow sort of an irresponsible thing to do, to not tell the truth. But the problem becomes, what, is this film in 100 years' time, is this going to be the document that everybody kind of refers to as the Doors story? Like Titanic. Is the film going to be the thing that everybody goes back to and goes, oh, this is what happened? And actually, oh yeah, you remember Titanic? Oh yeah, that was that love triangle, wasn't it? And there was like an iceberg or something as well, and that's the sort of danger. But I think, the argument is, well, people can tell the difference and they can separate this from the facts. But I don't know if you've seen it, there's a brilliant clip of John Densmore and Robbie Krieger from a few months ago talking about the Doors. And John Densmore says, oh yeah, and he said, oh yeah, Robbie, you came in with the song, didn't you? And and you started playing the first chords of Light My Fire, and then Ray sent us out onto the beach, and then we went for a walk on the beach. By the time we came back, he'd got the intro, and Robbie Craig he was like, no, that's what happened in the film. That isn't what, and he was there, and he's even recorded over his own memories with the film. So there is a kind of danger that the misrepresentation is becomes what the facts are. But
well, it's the myth, isn't it? And the myth is really powerful, and it is about myth making and myth building, and it does it so well. Like, you just want that to be how Light My Fire was written, regardless of whether it actually was, because it just looks, which is probably not how it really. You won't really want to see how those things actually get made.
Have you ever heard Mark Kermode talk about? He uses this as an example of sort of, don't want to put words in his mouth, but the moment where they where Manzarek sends them out to the beach and then comes up with the intro to Light My Fire, he always sort of damns this film because of that moment. And I said to him the other day, it's a brilliant time edit, because it's not saying they walk back in, he was playing that. It's a brilliant piece of filmmaking, because not only do we then hear the beginning of Light My Fire, which also isn't perfect. What you hear isn't the perfect version of it, but you also jump 6 months forward in time as well. So it's actually a brilliant piece of filmmaking. I said to Mark, I'm going to get that on record here.
Good. It's official now. All right. Anybody got any thoughts or questions that they wanted to raise? Yeah, right at the back at the start, please.
Oh yeah, it's a two-parter actually. First one is Mark. I wonder if you remember when you first watched when you were 14, it had one specific sequence or image or moment that really made that switch your mind from rock star to film, made you see the possibilities there. And also, size separate, but equally important. How do you feel about director cameos?
Yeah, the exact moment, the bit of the film that I stole for my new film is the bit where at dawn, where Morrison's walking along Sunset on a long lens, on like, it must be like on a 100mm lens walking towards the camera. That's the shot in the film, which is, I don't know if anybody even remembers it, but for me that was the shot that really jumped out. And I went and, like I tend to do, I get quite train spottery about these things. I went and found that location and went and shot a bit of film there, and I put that in the new film, but rather than it being the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, it was Gwinnett. But it has been cut from the film, unfortunately, for story reasons.
We will feel the presence.
Yeah. Yeah, and the director cameo is brilliant in this, because it's actually, like, Morrison was at UCLA studying film with Ray Manzarek and Coppola as well. I don't know if it was the same year, but roughly around the same time. And then Oliver Stone studied film at NYU, and his lecturer was Scorsese. So actually, that's his homage to Scorsese, which hence the small goatee. And director cameos. Yeah, I've got a cameo in my new film. Yeah, Ian's the supervising sound editor who sat here, and we actually we had a tough decision the other day to cut 50% of my dialogue. So I've only got one line, and I'm a silhouette, and only people who really know me very well will recognise the silhouette. That sounds like I'm nude.
Also inspired by The Doors. Well, I look forward to seeing it again and seeing what's left of the director. It was interesting to see Oliver Stone in that film school context for sure. Yeah, again,
Crit is brilliant.
Yeah,
we've both done higher education film crits before, and Kingsley's done a lot. They're not often quite as
not as boisterous as
not as
I think it could do with a bit more honesty. From people. I mean, yeah, just that is it's kind of, again, I'm not sure that ever really happens in those kinds of spaces, but it's a romantic idea of all of these students sort of sitting around having the confidence to just trash another student, and then was he going off in these digressions, and again, yeah, it's very, I love the bit about where they meet again on the beach, and he says he's been trying to get into movies, and the executive doesn't know who Goddard is again, which feels like Oliver Stone. But it's weird to think about Oliver Stone was a very, very popular mainstream filmmaker, but so much of his technique was not mainstream filmmaking.
Well, yeah, because he's sort of seen as an outsider, but I think he won his second Oscar during the shoot. I think he won. It was born on the 4th of July.
Yeah, would have been. Was that, 89.
Yeah, so he won Best Picture. So the stuff in the desert, he'd come from the Oscars, where he'd picked up Best Picture or Best Director, and then gone to the desert to shoot those sequences. He was like on top of the world. Then he went to the desert, shot those sequences, and then got in a huge amount of trouble for filming them there. But he was, had huge mainstream success and was a huge director, but still sort of thought of as an outsider.
Anyone else? The one down here. Do you want to? If you just wait. Yeah, thanks.
Mark, I don't know if you remember, we used to play football together. The last time we played, you told me off for not passing or not running or something like that at Newlyn. Right. And
it was probably projection.
Say again?
It was probably projection.
And I've lived in a foreign country for 10 years, but I followed your career through Kermode Mayo, and he's been obviously really...
Where was it you went again?
I lived in Spain for a while.
Right.
And Mark Kermode was obviously, bigging you up. Obviously, you listened to the podcast, and he was... And I was like, he's a Cornish boy, and even though he doesn't like me. Can
we edit this out?
No, my two questions are about the film. What, as a filmmaker, what do you make of the American, what do you call him? American, Indian that's always in the background when he's. That would be my first thing, my first question. Why do you think that was always in the background? And the second question would be, do you know when somebody is cast as a perfect role, do you think that was Val Kilmer's perfect role?
Yeah, I think to start with that one, I think definitely. I think that was the sort of, I don't know where you go from there, really. And I was listening to something today or yesterday, a podcast discussing the film, and people saying, if you do have the perfect role, then what does that do? What does that do for you the rest of your career? And somebody was saying what was lucky about him was that he didn't win the Oscar for that performance. He wasn't even nominated for it. And it's the same sort of school of thought as like Timmy Chalamet not winning for Dylan, that would have been the worst thing that could have happened, you know, because like the performance is there, the performance will be there, always there, and will always be great, but he hasn't sort of peaked with it. And so I think with Val Kilmer, maybe the same, maybe that it wasn't lauded in that way, maybe, you know, because he doesn't look like him, you know, when you see him ordinarily, he doesn't look like him, you know, before the wigs.
Excellent wigs all across that movie. I think it's interesting as well, like in terms of Val Kilmer as an actor who was associated with that role, and a lot of the perception of him is kind of tied in with that in terms of like what kind of person Val Kilmer is he was kind of labeled in the same ways that Morrison was labeled, and he kind of just let that be. You know, I think he's had an interesting career, and obviously in the last few years has been really, really sick, which is really a shame. But like he definitely allowed the myth of him and Morrison that sort of became this weird third thing to be what people thought about him. You know, because in that period he's amazing in so many things. You know, but even by like 95 in Heat, that's a comeback. You know, because after this film he doesn't do that thing of going on to the next, what everyone thinks is going to be the next thing. It is an interesting role, but I think it's interesting that he kind of used that in a way that a lot of people don't. I don't think he's necessarily looking at his career someone who is that, you know, he made that choice to allow that to happen, which I think is interesting in terms of how he thought about being a big Hollywood star, because he could have been huge in the 90s. And he kind of wasn't, you know, he kind of pops up in these different places, but sort of, you know, does have a really interesting sort of post-Doors life, considering just how big a performance that is, and how involved he is in it. Yeah, it's quite amazing.
And it'd be interesting to see the film with all the other people who were rumoured to be playing him, because it was going to be John Travolta for ages. Yeah, and like Travolta, it was said to have never have got over it. You know, he's put in all of this effort and all of this research. Tom Cruise, Bono, Ian Astbury.
Wow, okay, I can see Ian Astbury.
Yeah, because I think did he sing with the Doors?
Yes, he did.
Yeah, we saw it.
Yeah, we went to see
Right.
him, yeah.
That would make sense.
Yeah. And then the other part of the question with the Native American is that all goes back to the myth or the story that Morrison told about the going past the car crash, which is portrayed at the beginning of the film, and seeing this guy die and sensing that his soul had passed into him. So that's what to me it's like he's very passive in the way that he looks, but it becomes a sort of indictment on Morrison's behaviour, is the way that I read it. But I've never read that. I've never read it like that before. Now I'm an adult. I think he's sort of tutting at him, I think, by the end.
Oh yeah, he's definitely like, no, sorry, Chip. But it's interesting thinking about, again, like Oliver Stone and his kind of preoccupations, and that's an imagery and a sort of a through line in Natural Born Killers, which is not really in Tarantino's script at all. Which is he goes back to that as a filmmaker, and again that relationship between sort of an American history and a kind of contemporary moment, which I think is it's so interesting to rewatch that film as an Oliver Stone film, not as a Doors film or even as a music film, really. Although all those things are kind of at play. And just formally, it feels much more aligned to that kind of that experimentation he's doing in that early to mid part of the 90s. Got a couple, 3 at the back. Yeah, we'll move it up.
Yeah, I was just you were saying about Oliver Stone going back to certain things, and one often has been the sort of 60s dream turned bad. There's Morrison dying in 70 was perfect for the end of his days. But it doesn't seem to be a lot of films around that have done a similar thing with decades since. You know, it seems the 60s is such a good, with Vietnam and Nixon and all that kind of thing. And I don't know if that's something yet to be done. I mean, we're obviously living in a pretty weird decade, but any thoughts about, a narrative for a decade with bands and that sort of it?
I'll pass over in a sec. I think it's interesting as well, watching that, and obviously knowing Oliver Stone and his kind of, his own biography, but also the last film we watched here together, and this was Big Wednesday, and a lot of those themes are coming up in both of those films, aren't they? That kind of the impact of Vietnam, particularly, and that kind of 1968 moment on campuses. It's referenced here in terms of like, just very briefly in terms of shows that they can't do, but it's kind of in the background as that kind of end of a moment, end of an American moment, which, yeah, I think it holds such a powerful sway mythologically, I think, in kind of 20th century America, that in both the films we've done this for now, it hangs like this real sort of spectre over everything.
Yeah, and I think it was such a small amount of time as well. You know, it all sort of hangs around 67. You know, the build up to 67 and the fallout from 67. I don't think doesn't feel like, from my perspective, it doesn't feel like there's been a moment like that again. You know, where it was so significant and still feels significant, even if it's been mythologized and, you know, misrepresented. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the next moment is.
I think as well, you know, just this sort of popping into my head, but like, you know, John Milius and Oliver Stone and a lot of the people that ended up making films 90s, 2000s, you know, had a kind of different lived experience of that time, through the military or through other kind of things. And, you know, there aren't many filmmakers that have gone through similar things, you know, in terms of the people who are working, certainly at that level. Their background doesn't have the same kind of experience, I don't think, in terms of how they get into films, when they get into films, you know, and why they might do it, you know, what you know, the route to filmmaking industrially feels quite different, you know, which kind of pointed as well in terms of like film schools, you know, working in one, but like Morrison walks out, you know, and there are many stories, a lot of filmmakers walking out because of it being not, I don't think this is very true, but certainly the idea that it's not part of real experience, you know, and filmmakers ending up in places, but coming from all these different backgrounds, and sort of using film in a way that it doesn't really get used, certainly at that level. I don't think anymore. You know, I'm trying to think of filmmakers who would have served in a Gulf conflict, you know, or anything like that, and I can't think of any that have had that kind of experience in the way that Oliver Stone would have had, or Milius had, and people like that, when they're making these films, looking back at a time where they were much more closely connected to, you know, and even like even filmmakers who weren't necessarily in that space, but involved in civil rights, you know, marches on campus, or that, you know, those kinds of events don't seem as prevalent. But saying that, in the last couple of years, you know, working at university where there's been a much stronger engagement with politics, particularly around the climate crisis, and global conflicts, I wonder if we might see that in the future, you know, because I think there is a different campus life now in terms of young people's political engagement and how that might translate into their art. He says very hopefully and idealistically, maybe.
Yeah, because Oliver Stone would have been, I think he was in Vietnam in 67, did 2 years, or 3, he was supposed to do 4 and did 3, or was supposed to do 3 and did 2, but it was certainly away for, you know, he discovered the Doors in Vietnam. You know, he wasn't at home for all of that. So I heard something really slight tangent, but I don't know where I read it or where I heard it, but it was certainly in the last couple of days, that when in Morrison's apartment in Paris when he died, they found a copy of an early draft of Platoon. Yeah. Wow. I did have a nap this afternoon, so it might have come from there. But I might Google that before you decide to leave that. Yeah.
That would be a development period, wouldn't it?
I know. And it sounded amazing, and now I've said it out loud, it sounds nonsense. But I mean, you know, the reason Morrison was in California is because he wanted to make movies, and it's constantly referenced, you know, it's a filmmaker who likes to make references to movies through the film. That you know, that was what Morrison really wanted to do, was to make films. So it's not beyond, but I will Google it.
What this film and Born on the 4th of July seem to have in common is that trick from optimism to disillusion you very few use. And in terms of the kind of hippie cultures and the summer of love going off after, it only lasted 2 or 3 years before it is, got into the mire of drugs and the general, the optimism disappeared really and clearly in 4th of July, it's a different starting point, but optimistic, cracky type young Americans who get disillusioned by the reality of Vietnam very, very quickly. Strike me, but that theme to the.
I just, I think, I don't think he ever got over it. I think, you look across his body of work. I mean, you read Platoon, and he makes Heaven and Earth as well. There's Vietnam references in Natural Born Killers. Like, it comes up a lot. It's a kind of seismic moment. Salvador, Nixon. Yeah, I mean, like, just going back and back and back to that moment. Yeah. I'm just reading a book about Terrence Malick, and it's what you were saying about kind of optimism. But even he was at Harvard in the sort of the late '60s, and sort of Vietnam comes up in this. It's just, again, like what it was at the start, this kind of foreign thing, which is going to be, and what it felt like, and then obviously how that fed back, and people realized once they could see what was actually going on, how it very quickly changed, and how, again, like the role of television, which all that newsreel footage, which she kind of drops in, reminds you of just the power of the image, and what can't be unseen, and again, I think what's different now is the ubiquity of those images. I can't imagine what it'd been like to see that stuff on television in the 60s. Now that's everywhere all the time. It's kind of, there is a desensitization to all that stuff, but even in this context, it's powerful, and on a big screen, it's really overwhelming.
And the film's sort of microcosm of that disillusionment, because it goes downhill so quickly, the hope in this film and the idealism.
For me, that's historically correct.
Yeah.
It kind of, I mean, I was at university as a hippie. By the end of university, that sort of the optimism of it dissipates.
Yeah. Well, and also in this, when they play, like the record label people get interested when they're playing in the London fog before they've even played the Whiskey A Go Go, and they're saying, oh, you're great, this is amazing, and then have you thought of playing like Mrs. Brown, You've Got a Lovely Daughter style music? So immediately trying to commercialize something that they can sort of, something that's interesting and try and commercialize it straight away. So that's sort of that optimism and that idea is just diluted straight away, which I think the film's a good microcosm of it.
It almost all happens, doesn't it, on stage when he's having that breakdown on stage, and they've got montage in the background with Nixon and all of the other things that are going on, and the riots and other things. It's all in that one scene, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. All catches up with him, and he basically, and he sort of says this. Yeah, he says it earlier on, but it's the line, it's not real, and it's like I'm going to mention Bono again, second time. But there's a great quote by Bono, and I don't think he's done many, but he said America's still the greatest idea we've had, and I think that's like really telling, that there's this idealism, but it never works out.
No, it is a myth. It doesn't bear up to the reality of the experience. There was another one, yeah, Matt.
One of the things I was looking for in the film was what I would describe as a sort of like a contact high from the drug taking, and how the filmmaking about drug taking can give you that sort of like that brush with a stoned experience. And I think the film, what I wasn't expecting is that the entire film was basically a cocktail of that sort of like West Coast stoner seeker. And I still feel a bit buzzy now from the, and how sort of like the Morrison character sort of like uses that as a breakthrough way of finding inspiration and expression, and how the filmmaking translates some of that in, like, often filmmakers use the sort of like the drug scene as an excuse to break rules or to include elements that are not part of the physical world of, you know, things. And it seemed like this film is like just from beginning to end constantly sort of like exploring that a little bit. But I wondered if there's a sort of like a bit where you can kind of feel like you can taste the heroin or taste the acid or taste the marijuana or something, like the way in which the mode of the film is communicating a distinct sense of off your tits.
I think interesting you talk about that, because I think that there is a structure to the film which probably you could tie onto, not necessarily his drug use, but certainly that, again, which goes back to this idea of that the flow from one period to another, you know, which often is tracked in terms of like, sort of marijuana, LSD, acid, through to, you know, there's a little bit of cocaine in there, but then it becomes about heroin, you know. And I'm interested by that idea a lot, thinking about hearing you say it in terms of how the filmmaking represents those drugs sort of symbolically. Because the opening feels so joyously high, you know, and kind of optimistic, and like it's not a bad, such a pleasant experience. And then it becomes much more, kind of jarring as it goes through, and, you know, the psychedelics give way to heroin. It becomes a very, very sort of, which is, you know, I think very much, and, you know, there's the Janis Joplin thing as well in there as well, you know, like it is, we know this story, but it's an interesting way to tell it, I think, formally. I'd never thought of that, and even watching it, but looking back from you saying, I think there is, you can see there's distinct periods which almost align to the drugs that they're taking. And obviously when the band stop their journey, that's when he just moves away from them because he's on a different journey, which I think happens a lot.
At the beginning, the drug is sort of the thing that makes you feel high, is the light and the sunshine, and everything's outside. You know, he even lives outside. But the film then really moves indoors for kind of the rest of the film. It's you know, the New York stuff is that party that they're at. It's just like, just want to get out of that scene. Oh, so claustrophobic, yeah. And it's really clever. I mean, the other thing we haven't mentioned is how, I mean, it's beautifully shot, this film. Robert Richardson, who's like, you know, done a lot of Oliver Stone's films and shoots Tarantino's stuff and Scorsese's, but I think working with Oliver Stone is when he's his most experimental. But also the sound, and in that party there's so much non-sync dialogue going on, so there's voices that aren't attributed to characters, and then it gets to the point where you've got characters who aren't speaking but you can hear their voices, and it's just insanity inducing. And, you know, and all of the Velvet Underground oil and water projections and all that kind of stuff, it's like it's horrible, it's so grim. And even when they get outside, it's like dark and cold, and it's snowing, and, you know, and it feels like this descent has already started, and everything gets, and, you know, and I picked this film because it had a massive influence on me, but I did think it quite aligns with Big Wednesday, being a sort of LA set film, but then hardly any of it's in LA, and then the stuff that is in LA, it's in little rooms, which I hadn't really noticed until today.
But when we talked about Big Wednesday as well, we talked about that move away from that idyllic. Even in Big Wednesday, at the start of the film, they're all right on the beach all the time. And then as time progresses, they get further and further away from the beach, which is further and further away from the idealism as well. And I think there are a lot of parallels there, certainly in terms of filmmakers working through their stuff through that moment in time. The New York scene is brilliant. Truman Capote is hilarious how he's describing everything. What he calls them, like how he describes the band is brilliant. It's a very funny movie in a lot of ways. Which
Jim Morrison from the Doors musical group.
Yeah, it's hilarious. And it's interesting. I don't know if anyone's seen the Velvet Underground documentary by Todd Haynes, where they kind of touch a little bit on the Velvets in LA and San Francisco, and how hated they were out there, and how they were kind of seen as this real antithesis. So it's a nice moment to see him in that space, you know, just for those people who know that they were very much, you know, they were not a band that traveled the Velvet Underground, even in America, which I think is great. And not that they cared. Was there anyone else who had anything else to?
I was just going to say, I felt that the beginning of the film was really colourful, and it reminded me of like a cine camera in the 60s. and I thought it was really atmospheric, and I really liked the really close-up scenes. You know, I think that made you feel that you were there, and I really liked the big landscapes. So the contrast. I feel quite nervous, but yeah, I found it a bit self-indulgent. I've got a bit bored with the main character. He was a predator. It doesn't go well now. But I thought it was pretty. I was more interested in the styling of it. You know, our houses would look nice, styled like it. You know, I think it stood the test of time. Do you think?
Yeah, I thought that early on. Actually, I was like, just that again, just the filmmaking, like the beautiful vistas, how it kind of started with this epic scope, but then very early on, particularly in his and Pamela's relationship, there's these beautiful close-ups. You know, like really intimate, really, and on the big screen with Val Kilmer and her, and parts of the way the lighting on parts of the body, I thought it was exquisite. And it's interesting because I've written about music films a lot, not like necessarily narrative, but certainly sort of documentaries. And they do this thing when they tell the story chronologically, which is that they end up with so much of the time on the downside, the dark side, the descent. You know, because that is the story. And, you know, it doesn't matter what you do about the talent or the genius or even the reasons why. When you spend a lot of time there, I think it does take a toll. And it makes it really hard at the end to remember what was the reason they got in that place in the first place. You know, all of those opportunities they had to be predators, to do the drugs, to be, you know, came from a sequence of things which start with in talent. And the thing about the Herman's Hermits thing is great because they stick to their guns at the moment they need to, and then later on it becomes more complicated. Just what I loved about it was the ending and how quiet it was, and how beautiful that moment is where she's in the thing, because even she doesn't say anything too much. It's quite a bleak in terms of she sort of references the death that he has been talking about a lot, but it felt like a moment where you were allowed to remember, you know, that what this person was, why they ended up in a bathtub. It wasn't, I think a lot can be quite ghoulish when they sort of portray the end of people's lives, particularly like famous icons. And I hadn't seen it in a long time, and I could see the foreshadowing in the bathtub, and I was like, oh, it's going to be, but it's not. It's really quiet, and it gives a dignity in it. And I loved that it ended with her, you know, and her sort of confidence in her role in his life. I thought is an agency that women don't always get as well. So not huge. I'm not saying it's like, but I was surprised at how moving and tender it was at the end.
And he was able to write that ending because there's so much, there isn't really a record of what happened. You know, it's contradictory stories, and also the way that in France, the way that they sort of sealed the coffin and everything like that, there was a lot of mystery. So it gave him the opportunity to write that ending. But yeah, it's right what you're saying about, I think that's quite a big point about him being a predator, because it's also like, you know, men got away with that sort of behavior, but also as a film, even though it's 1990, 1991, you couldn't have that sequence of him creeping into her room in the middle of the night played as sort of romance now. You know, with, I can't remember the one of the tracks off American Prayers playing underneath it, I think, and it's just played as a sort of like montage where he just climbs in and sort of says,
we just caught up with what that thing really is. You know, I watched this is a tangent, but I watched Funny Face over Christmas with Audrey Hepburn and Fred Astaire, which is a wonderful movie. But he is an absolute predator in that movie. Like, he just kisses her willfully every time he wants. He just says, "Oh, I'm going to kiss you," and he just kisses her. And but at the time that was accepted, not right, but it's accepted. And you know, we have moved to the place where we acknowledge what that really is. But I think it's interesting, yeah, that you and again, which is, it's kind of thrilling to watch it, because you know that all of those things which are, you know, sticky now, are in that movie because when it was made in the 90s, where we had not caught up, and wondering about what John Travolta would have been in that movie. Too old by 91 anyway. But also, like, how would you tell that story now, and what could you retain about the spectrum of a person like that?
Well, they become double period films, don't they? So the film becomes a period film, and when it was made, and the subject matter is a specific period as well. But it's like I watched. I'd never seen a James Bond film until I had COVID a couple of years ago, and decided to sit and watch some James Bond films, and that with no knowledge of James Bond. I mean, that is unbelievable, because that's a government sanctioned, publicly funded sex offender that is like a national treasure. And I haven't seen any of the later ones. Presumably that's sort of been addressed a little bit. But also, I just made a film that's got a time travel element in it, and part of my research was to watch Quantum Leap. And I mean, he is a sort of what do you call it? What's
serial sex offender?
Yeah, but what's it? Quantum physicist, sex offender. He goes and has sex with people who think he's somebody else. Would it get, when you watch it, and it's and it's sort of played for laughs, and so you couldn't do that anymore.
I wonder why you stopped mentioning Quantum Leap when referring to the new film. It's because you watched some of it and you were like, maybe not. But yeah, I think the other thing to note in terms of the time period of the film is the early 90s cast of it. It feels like a real kind of snapshot of early 90s Hollywood stars and well, not stars necessarily, but actors like Michael Madsen, Frank Whaley. All these faces were just so ubiquitous. It kind of has this real time capsule moment for the Hollywood period when it's made, which kind of adds to the LA-ness of it as well. I mean, Kevin Dillon as John Densmore is fantastic, but there's a really, I don't know, I just felt like, I'm taken back to not just that period of, that it's kind of in the film, but also the period when it was made. And for someone who, those were the actors I saw over and over again in that period, all across, so it's kind of excited to see them again. And Billy Idol, pre-wedding singer Billy Idol, it's unrecognisable in that as well.
And he was supposed to have a much bigger role, but he fell off his motorbike.
You see him on crutches.
Yeah. So he wanted to still be in the film, but it looked like he was coming straight from the hospital each time he had a scene. Yeah. Fuck off, Ray.
Is that the line that's in your new film? I was trying to work out which is the line in the new film. Is it one of the ones about the penises? Just down the front here.
Yeah, it was just a personal reflection about how I experienced the film when I originally watched it. And that was usually after a few beers, VHS copy, so crappy TVs. And it was all about the performance. It was all about music, because that's what I was into at the time. But seeing it on the big screen, it's completely reflected for me. So now it's about the visuals. Particularly that per hour is just absolutely stunning and innovative and just what he's guided without, in that period where CGI and things just,
not quite prevalent, what it is now, what take you to do it, how he was able to, you talked about telepath.
Thank you. Yeah. And it was just so, like I said, it was thrilling to watch a film made by a filmmaker, in a time where that stuff just not, films don't feel like that at that scale. It was, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's the same for me. I watched it because I was interested in Jim Morrison when I first saw it, and now I watch it for the filmmaking, because there's some computer generated stuff in there, but it was expensive, so it was used really sparingly. So it was used to do things like make the moon really big. These little tiny little twists that you think, what? There's something not quite right with that image, and it just sort of really throws you off. Yeah, but sort of, too much. It's kind of too easy, whereas it was used for a reason here.
So nice place to end. And we'll all be watching Rosa Nevada for Doors references in the very, very near future, hopefully. Thank you to everyone for coming out. I'm sure there's more to say, but we'll leave it there because everyone wants to go home and ponder. But thank you so much for coming out. Thanks to Newlyn Filmhouse for hosting us again. Thanks to Mark for picking the film.
Thanks to Neil and the Cinematologist podcast for their amazing output. And if you don't subscribe to the podcast, then do, because it's great.
Thank you. Thanks to Alistair and Cara and all the team at the Filmhouse. Thanks to Mark for kind of picking the film and sort of generously co-hosting it with me. And thanks to the audience, for kind of sticking around and engaging with it in such an interesting way. Dario, where do you want to kick off this chat?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing is just on the film, The Doors as a film. I really did agree with Mark where the first hour is just kind of exhilarating. That sort of development of them as a band, and in a way where it kind of takes you through his formation of the things he's interested in and settles it within the context of kind of like the late 60s.
Yeah.
Because I think that sort of period between sort of 66 and 70 musically and film wise is so mythologized.
Yeah.
You know, you've got all of that sort of blues rock kind of development. You know, you got Hendrix, you got the Stones, you got Cream, you know, and then the Doors sort of sitting maybe kind of slightly outside of that.
Led Zeppelin,
of course, with the documentary I've just been writing about. But it's interesting to kind of think about what you guys were saying about the Doors as a testament to the Doors, as a historical monument.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking about Titanic, but again, I think JFK one is more kind of apt for this discussion, isn't it? Because, you know, there is that sort of sense in which these films do that thing of historicizing. They create history.
Yeah.
And Mark sort of alluded to that. But it does get awfully baggy in the middle. And, you know, that sort of sense of what is Oliver Stone interested in here? Because I mean, watching it now at my age, I felt kind of like that this guy is really kind of scuzzy, that it's pathetic, you know, and I don't know. I think sometimes I have a big problem with the mythologization and of the idea of charisma in certain figures who are, you know, essentially, you know, drug takers, you know, supposed to be these poets of a generation, but end up embracing that sort of myth of self-destruction, and bringing down everything else and everybody around them down at the same time.
Yeah.
You know, and I think sometimes also it to use as a sort of a base term, sometimes it that feels to me as if it's a defense against them being overrated and a sense of their own insecurity about how great they actually are. Because I mean, you were talking about that idea of make the myth. And there's that one scene where they're in the bathroom with oh God, what's the Kathleen Quinn, who's great in this, by the way. She's really good. Who sort of says, well, you know, it's all bullshit that your parents died. And I like that sort of sense of which the filmmaker is playing with the mythologization, but yet behind it all is just a guy who grew up in a middle class family. And that sort of sense of the whole of the late 60s generation of drop out. And they could all drop out because they essentially knew they had a backup plan. And I think that is kind of there in the subtext more than in the text itself. But yeah, it was interesting to me just how much I thought Stone was kind of like being very unsympathetic, and how much he actually, whether I agree with Mark about how much he kind of brings it back at the end is an interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that kind of how much of it is actually about the Doors and Jim Morrison, how much of it is about Oliver Stone and his ideas of the 60s and his, you know, I think it is an interesting question. And, you know, I mean, sort of flippantly sort of said like about him that, you know, never kind of got over Vietnam. And there's definitely a sense that he's bitter about the idea not being fulfilled and that promise not being fulfilled of that period, you know. And I think, you know, famously Ray Manzarek hates this film because it just says that's not who he was. Like, he was a funny guy, you know, and all of that is kind of pushed to the side in a kind of in service of the myth, in service of this or the filmmaking idea. So I can kind of see if you if you saw that as a representation and you knew the person, you'd be like, this is it's an unfair thing because it leads people to think that he's this scuzzy creep when more nuanced than that. But that doesn't serve the idea. That's not what that's there for. It is a kind of symbol. And it means that it's more about Stone than arguably anything else, or his idea of America, which again is, what people said about JFK, like he's not interested in facts. He's not interested in what he's interested in. His relationship to that, it's basically they're very personal films, but then massive big budget things, which I think is an interesting dichotomy. And I think, it's interesting in terms of like the way that figures like that self-destruct when placed under a particular lens, and it's interesting that that's something that recurs throughout rock history, right up to Kurt Cobain, really, where
would you not say from a cinematic perspective though that one of the problems with this movie is it doesn't sustain it's difficult. You get to a point where you've kind of had your fill of watching him being pissed on stage.
Well, yeah, and I liked thinking about it in the idea of that. I think Matt Rogers, who says it in the comment, who I work with at Falmouth, was sort of thinking about in terms of like this relationship to the drugs that are fueling every moment. And I thought that's it. But again, that's conceptually interesting to think actually once it hits booze and heroin,
it's kind of over.
It's just as any kind of joyous, it's gone beyond the transcendental. It's gone to the really self-destructive. It's mired then, which is interesting. Like, yeah, conceptually, but not necessarily in terms of entertainment. But that also ties in with sort of thing I mentioned about music biopics, and I think arguably biopics about artists generally fall into this habit. If they're going to do an extended period of time, the chronology is because that's the period where it all goes to shit, and that's in the case of someone like Jim Morrison, that's the highway to the end. So you do, and I think the thing is, because we as audiences know that and we feel that chronology as it's growing, we're enjoying the first hour. Oh, it's really light, and it's, oh, isn't he cool, and isn't he interesting, and isn't it great how they did, but then once you start to see that activity, then, well, this is just a downward slide into essentially death. And that's hard going, and I think that is, it's one of the things about chronology and in that storytelling, which I always find kind of undermine. It can't help but undermine the first hour where you are actually spending time with the reasons why that person got to that point in the first place, and whether they can handle it or not, is a very difficult question the film can't answer. But you end up sort of spending time with them at their worst for so long, and that's the lasting image. And I think the film does try and pull that back, but there's a long period there where you are just watching him suffer and watching him make everyone else suffer because he can't handle the situation, and that's a slog. And whether that is the goal of the film, I don't know, but it certainly felt and it does make it feel baggy, and it makes it feel like, oh, it's hard going.
Yeah, and I was wondering as well whether or not, particularly musical artists, but maybe artists in general, and the way that they are turned into discourses, to use a wacky phrase, but there seems to be only two options, which is to sell out or to self-destruct.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that there's a subgenre of selling out, which is just become mediocre,
Yeah.
And I think that I was thinking about this. It's really a sort of problematic in the way that sort of culture defines what art is and what artists can or can't do.
Yeah.
There's very, I think one of the sort of laziest criticisms that you get all the time which is, oh, they're not as good as they used to be, or, that again, that sort of sense of where is this tragedy, or is this actually, like something to kind of be lauded, the myth on the of the James Dean, the Jimi Hendrix, the die young, from a kind of aesthetic standpoint, but also from they never reached the point of critique. You know what I mean? Where it's kind of like, well, this person's producer. I mean, it's interesting because obviously like Morrison wanted to be a poet, and I mean, I don't think he ever saw himself as a musician in that.
No, it's interesting, like Jenkin talking about him as a filmmaker and like going to film school and how the film implies that, and that there was a Tom DiCillo film a couple of years ago, documentary which incorporates some of the footage that Jim Morrison was shooting as a filmmaker, but when he died, so yeah, arguably the musician part was not where his focus was.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting there to compare it to, or to see it in the context of watching Val Kilmer, the documentary, but also sort of thinking just about Val Kilmer as a presence, because we were talking about this last night when we were having a chat, and I said to you, he's always struck me as a sort of enigmatic figure, but a figure that kind of distances you as an actor, and maybe there's that sense of him being a technical actor, but not somebody who, when you're watching him on screen, kind of allows you in the way that other performers are able to. And I don't want to see that as a criticism, but I don't know. It's just the way I feel it. And even with sort of Jim Morrison, there is a sense in which you are kept at arm's length a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know whether you agree with that, or is that there's any specific performances where he does get to that sort of more.
Yeah, I think. I mean, yeah, been thinking about that since we talked about it, and obviously in the last couple of weeks, thinking about his roles and performances and what they are, And he was a massively respected actor, and I think that there is, he's obviously tapping into something which I think is significant and meaningful in order to make these really kind of memorable performances, but they're not necessarily, kind of emotionally welcoming. They feel, capital A acted. And I mean, I don't mind. I love that, and I think, and I like watching that. And we sort of mentioned Tombstone, that, chatting to friends about Val Kilmer after he died. The film that came up the most for people was Tombstone, where he gives this amazing performance as Doc Holliday. But it's kind of in comparison to Kurt Russell, who is a very, very different kind of actor. And I think again it's the casting works really well, with Heat, in terms of him in relationship to other actors in the film, and where he's given the space to do that, and sort of encouraged to do that, and just where he sort of pops up in different places doing different things. I've just ordered, and I think, thinking about him as a technical actor, I think one of the interesting things of the film that I wanted to see after he died, which I just ordered on VHS, was Top Secret.
Right.
Because he's really funny, and I think about, one of the films I love him in the most is Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. But his technical delivery of comedy, like screwball comedy, his understanding of the technique is absolutely amazing. Like his delivery in that film, he could have been in a 40 screwball comedy easily. Like and that's what I like about him, is like you can see that he's very, very committed to technique and craft. Often probably at the expense of maybe what the film is trying to do.
Yeah.
But there is a kind of, he's obviously interested in something about Morrison that allows him to do that performance. Just to cut back slightly, I think one of the interesting things that you were sort of saying about stars who die young, one of the things about Morrison, which is quite different, is that he's already on the decline. He can't be preserved in amber because he's bloated, which I hadn't really thought about before, but just thinking about it then, he doesn't quite fit in the absolute pinnacle, going out of the pinnacle. So I just wanted to come back to that, because that made me think of that. Interesting. But to go back to Kilmer, I think that he stands out for, a really diverse array of performances, all of which are committed to craft. And at his best, I think, when he's well directed, he kind of fits in with the world of the film. And that, the Michael Mann thing, I think, is interesting, because he's obviously he's allowed to do some really interesting work in Heat, in the way that all of these actors are encouraged to do something which is kind of challenging what we kind of understand of them from other screen roles. But maybe his commitment to doing something very specific is one of the reasons why he ended up with the career that he had, because people maybe, aside whether they thought he was difficult or not, were like, well, actually, is he gonna blend in, or is he gonna stand out? And some filmmakers are happy, and obviously in the case of Jim Morrison, you need him to stand out. he needs to be this kind of pinnacle.
Yeah, I mean, just watching the documentary, which is a sort of intimate, self-authored piece, because, I mean, it's something I know, he just shot and shot and shot. Yeah, essentially behind the scenes, home movie stuff for decades, so it's got all of the loads of private moments, loads of discussions with his son who voiceovers the film, because obviously he had the throat cancer and had the operation and was speaking with, which is just tragic when you think of his voice as well. It's not something I kind of registered or connected to Kilmer particular, but then when you watch the documentary and you hear him with the thing, and then you listen to his voice in roles, he's got that. It's a sort of soft, earthy California baritone, but it's measured, serious.
Yeah.
It doesn't slip into like Matthew McConaughey or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's not surfer dude either.
Yeah, no.
So the voice is really kind of important, and I think it was really weird watching it, because obviously you hear the son speak in voiceover for the first time. I was like, hang on a minute, have they done that?
Yeah.
Is this an AI moment where they've kind of cloned it? And no, but it just does sound like him. But there is a sort of, that lends the film almost immediately a kind of pathos.
Yeah.
To know that the son is lending that kind of resonance. And the film does set up this kind of making of, but not in an overtly meta way, but the idea that we know that this is construction.
Yeah.
And I think one of the connections between Morrissey and Morrison, you can leave that in if you want, Morrison and Kilmer, is this interest in the sort of poetic self-mythologization. And he talks about sort of embracing this idea of persona as a mode of performance. It's interesting. There's one moment in the documentary where he's kind of like, he's in class and he's doing a performance, and he does it in this way which is kind of like outside of what you would ordinarily do in this particular character. And the teacher says, why did you do, he sort of over exaggerates the things a lot. And the teacher says, why did you sort of put that on top of it and stuff? And Kilmer sort of says, well, I don't have that experience, so I was trying to sort of manifest it from the outside, not really understanding what that feeling is. And this teacher sort of berates him and kind of almost sort of says it's an actor's job to think that they've had the experience even if they haven't had it.
Mm.
You know what I mean? To be able to embody the idea and fit themselves into the space of having experience. You can see him kind of like reacting to that, and I think that provides a sort of tenor for the whole film where he's playing around with metamorphosis, time.
Yeah.
But it's really strange, kind of. I mean, trying to sort of think about how you adopt that method.
Yeah, and it speaks to a lot of that stuff of like, kind of being driven by a kind of an ideological thing rather than an aesthetic thing or a performance thing. It's like, it's always about, there has to be a, something relatable or something, and it's like, can it be something else, and he was a strange actor, and I mean that as a compliment, like, just, there is a strangeness to him, which I think is probably where I do get drawn in. I'm not drawn in on a kind of like emotional, I'm
psychological.
Yeah, I'm like drawn into, because I'm like, what's going on? Like, who is this person? Not like but who is this person that I'm being presented with? Like, who, which I think is interesting. It's like he's trying to find it, by the sounds of it, through that performance, and never the same way, and again, I mean, that's interesting because a lot of the stuff that's come out in the last few years around that book by Isaac Butler about the method has been about like, well, this is what the method is, everything, and this is what acting is, and it's not just, not just doing that very narrow thing. So, no, I hope it didn't affect him too much to be berated.
Well, I mean, it's one of those things. I think that the film, I think, sort of really offers an insight into his relationships with people, and I think that sometimes it's quite overt like that, where they've shown that to say this had an impact, and then there's other parts like there's a really interesting sort of dynamic on the island of Dr. Moreau with him and Brando and David Hewis, and the director, because John Frankenheimer took over that movie. And was just basically said, look, bring this fucking movie home because it's just getting out of control. And there was just massive fallings out with Brando, and Brando basically gave up. And there's an amazing moment where they had a stand-in, a double for Brando when he was just walking around, just some big fat guy basically. And he said, and Kilmer's sister-in-law, there's Brando's body double. What's your name, mate? And he goes, Norm. Because there's Norm. It's me, and I mean, so that's what So there's like tension between him and Fulis.
Yeah.
So that's really kind of interesting. And then it does move into the question of his, surliness or difficulty. And he sort of doesn't see it. I mean, it was interesting to sort of hear him talk about Cruise on Top Gun, because that was his third film. So he was as much a breakout star of Top Gun as anybody that made it into what he is. And I think he's just, the way that it was conceived in the documentary was that he was somebody who cared about the work.
Yeah.
And there's a fine line between caring about the work and then being eccentric or being difficult.
Yeah.
Or you see it in the actor studio interviews and stuff like that. It's like I want it to be the best that it can be.
Yeah.
And that I think rubs people up the wrong way when either certain decisions have been taken or people just want to get the thing done and move on.
Yeah. I think there's that great documentary about the making of Island of Dr. Moreau, which was
seen like ages ago.
But it's interesting how he's kind of involved like from very early on, and he's very committed to the work. Like he doesn't come across badly in that. It's an absolute shit show of a production, but he doesn't come across as someone who's actually interested in doing good work. And I just read that John Lurie memoir, and he talks a lot about that in terms of like coming up against the system, and the system being like, well, just do this. And he's like, no, I want it to be good.
Yeah.
Like if I do it like this, or we do it like this, it'll be good. And he had the same reputation. People were like, oh, don't work with him, he's difficult. And he was like, well, it's difficult wanting it to be good, because then, but in that kind of massive system, they're not interested in that. Like you say, and at the point where Frankenheimer comes into that film, it's like, we just got to get it done. So, but how can an actor switch to not caring when he's invested so much? There's also a side, I don't know if you remember the great Ron Perlman WTF, where he talks about working on that film with Brad. He does a great story about working on that film with Brando, which I just think is absolutely, I won't ruin it now, it's well worth digging out, it's hilarious. That production is kind of legendary.
That's a great episode, that actually. Yeah, and just to sort of finish off on the doc, I mean, it's really interesting about his father, who he kind of bailed out at one point, who wanted to be this like landowning magnate, and this sort of living up to what his father kind of wanted him to be, the death of his brother and how that changed his father, and the sort of divorce that kind of affected his relationship with mother, because he ends up, because of his father had all the money and basically he got custody. So really interesting, sort of somebody who's got that level of documentation is able to put together a sort of sense of themselves and fragments in a kind of collage space. And then the very ending is interesting because it does very specifically play up the connection between him and Morrison. So it intercuts that final scene, which might have been the scene that's been removed. I don't know which, the version that you saw, but I'm pretty sure the Amazon version, they maybe didn't have this, but I don't know if I'm misremembering. But there's a scene where Morrison is in the voiceover booth. He is talking about, some people see me as the Lizard King, some people see me as the black-clad demon. And they cut in earlier in the Morrison film, him sort of as. And then when he says the black-clad demon, they cut in a scene from Batman.
Okay. Yeah.
And he said, but really I'm says, some people see me as the clown.
Yeah.
And they cut to him in the makeup as Mark Twain, because he's self-financed. He sold all his land off to self-finance this Mark Twain theatre production. So I think, it sort of really does make this connection.
Yes.
Kilmer as an artist, not just an actor. And he was always kind of searching for that creative outlet. And I think, struggled with the relationship between commercialism as Iceman, and then, you know, wanting to do something. Right at the end, he talks about this legacy of, I want to do something that's, you know, an artistic legacy in American culture. He offered himself on that. Wow. And then, you know, doing the Mark Twain thing, it was his sort of attempt to kind of get to that.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, in terms of like film and popular music as these spaces where artists have, you know, artists, not just, you know, but artists have kind of ended up in there using those as the vehicles for something grander, weirder, whatever. But they are such kind of large, kind of, you know, behemoths of industry, as well as that they'd, you know, film has chewed up and spat out loads of actors, directors, writers of the same, and pop music the same. It's like the, you know, the amount of people who have not survived that machinery is kind of legend. Also interesting, you made that kind of faux pas about Morrison. Morrissey is exactly what happens when you don't die young. You turn into this kind of right-wing horror, and you undermine your entire poetic legacy. You know, let's go back to that.
But I want to go back and watch a few of his films that I haven't seen for a while, like The Ghost in the Darkness. I remember liking that.
Yeah.
And Kiss Kiss Bang Bang again. I mean they're all about doing a sequel to the Nice Guys, which I think is a kind of a similar film.
Yeah.
To Kiss Kiss Bang.
Yeah, very similar film. That's Russell Crowe and Ryan Gosling, isn't it? Yeah. That was a good movie.
Yeah, it was a good movie, and a good part, you know, chemistry part.
Yeah.
But yeah, really enjoyed, and with a, you know, with a heavy heart, sort of, you know, watching that film, but also kind of thinking through a very specific performer. I think more, maybe now when you think about it, more specific than you credit for.
Yeah, and just grateful that he was around at a time where there was still spaces to do that kind of work. You know, you kind of think of where those kinds of performances would sit now, and it's much harder to see where someone is allowed to even do that occasionally or sporadically. And we do have, it's such an interesting body of work, you know. And I think of the film, which I know is a kind of like, it's an interesting film in terms of its politics, like David Mamet's Spartan,
I don't think I've seen that.
which is really, it's a good movie because of Kilmer, you know, like his performance kind of drives it. And I remember sort of reading about some of its kind of like right-wing politics afterwards. Like, I kind of like didn't really pick up on it because the character and his performance is kind of not, you got so drawn into that part of it that I kind of missed the stuff that was going on around it. But I'd like to revisit that particularly. And then, you know, just always loved the fact that he, you know, he popped up in True Romance Unseen as Elvis, you know, so he's played Elvis in Jim Morrison, which I think is, you know, he has those kinds of connections to popular culture, and it's interesting that there is that sort of, you know, that link between them in the documentary, which that's what I want to see. I definitely want to sort of see that film.
Yeah, and just finally on the doc, I wanted to say this early on, but went out of sync. But anyway, there is a lot of kind of melancholia in the doc. So and I think it's not, it doesn't kind of reach the level of kind of like maudlin, but, you know, watching him sign autographs over and over again at Comic-Con. I mean, to me, Comic-Con is just like hell on earth, the concept of it anyway, but just seeing him having to sign his image as Iceman, and you be my wingman.
Yeah.
100 times. And all the people there are perfectly pleasant to him and say, we love you.
Yeah.
And there's a sort of, you get the warm, but yeah, there is that sort of sense of stardom kind of becomes that, because, you know, obviously you have money problems.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you got medical bills, you know, as well, you know, like, but one of the interesting things about doing the screening and why sort of bringing it forward is suddenly saw images of him in this film that haven't seen images of him, but obviously like a lot of the stuff that's been circulating is images of him as Jim Morrison. So it's kind of, it's, the hope is, as with so much of the episodes, and again, one of the reasons when Mark said to do it was like, yeah, because wouldn't it be great if more people just went back and watched The Doors, you know? And now I think they will for other reasons, but it's a great piece of work as a for him as an actor particularly. It's kind of, and hopefully it will be seen as it kind of deserves to be seen as a performance. And the film again seen as this, yeah. And I doing the episode made me think of Oliver Stone in a different way. And I rewatched Natural Born Killers a few years ago, and I remember loving that film in the mid-90s, but then I was like, oh, I'm not sure. But then I think there's a lot of connections to this film aesthetically and ideologically in terms of what he's interested in. Again, American myth. So it's kind of like it's changed my perception of him. And I mean, I love JFK and I love Born on the 4th of July. But again, I'm definitely someone who's not necessarily thought about Oliver Stone as a filmmaker in a long time. And this made me really excited to kind of rethink about him as a filmmaker. Yeah. And a great director of actors. The performances in The Doors are really, really good.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that brings us to the end. We're going to go over and now change gear and get into Polish cinema.
Oh, yeah.
So if that floats your boat, then please come and join us on the Patreon channel. Neil, anything else to say? Any other final comments? Final thanks?
Just reiterating the thanks. I think, again, an episode like this comes together because of, well, in this case, two cinemas, audiences and collaborators like Mark. So thanks to everyone who's come up, who's kind of helped us put this episode together. The community around the podcast is really cherished. So thanks to everyone who's keep supporting it.
Yeah, very well said. Agree with that totally. So that's it. Thank you very much for your continued support of the podcast. This has been the Cinematologist podcast. Thanks for listening.